Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Before I introduce our speaker today, it's our tradition to go around the room and say our name. If I may, I'll begin. My name is Roy.
Stuart.
I'm Greg.
Andrew. My name is Gary.
Sharon.
I'm Joe.
Julian.
Trevor. Jason.
My name is Mark.
I'm David.
I'm Michael.
My name is Tom.
Jim.
Max.
Chris.
Michael.
My name is David.
I'm Jerry.
My name is Jerry.
My name is Oswaldo.
I'm Clint.
Ben.
Peter.
George.
My name is Cass.
Tony.
My name is David.
My name is Bob.
Stephen.
Risha. My name is Hal.
Tim.
I'm Joe.
Andrea. Jay.
Thank you. It's always my pleasure to introduce Danadasa, who has been practicing with the San Francisco Buddhist Center community since 1993 and was ordained in 2011. Danadasa was here a year ago and did a wonderful series, a 4-week series, which he is doing a new 4-week series for us beginning today. His current area of exploration is the Buddhist teaching on anatta and emptiness. Often mystifying to many Westerners, the Buddha described these teachings as deep, hard to see, hard to realize, beyond the scope of reason, subtle. During this 4-week series, we will explore with him ways of approaching these teachings and ways of seeing these mysterious truths in our daily lives. Next week, for instance, he's going to start with using the mind to free the mind. The week after is the path of self-surrender and the path of self-discovery. And the last week is a universe imbued with compassion. But today, to kick off his series, he will explore the taste of freedom and the wisdom of the body. Welcome, Danadasa.
Thank you, Roy. Yeah, well, it's really delightful to be here, so welcome to everyone. And in particular, I might be doing this quite a bit because I like to see people. And there's some people hiding behind this beam here. But I'd actually like to extend a warm welcome to Julian. This is my son, Julian. And this is Julian's partner, Trevor. And I just wanted to say welcome and how delighted I am to have you both here. And also how wonderful it is to actually have some young people here amongst us. So welcome. It's lovely to have some old people here too. That is good. Yeah. So we're going to be here together for 4 weeks, and it's really good that we'll be here together for 4 weeks because we're going to be exploring this teaching of anatta, which is usually translated as this doctrine of no self, and also this teaching of emptiness, which is a translation of shunyata. Now, as Roy said in the intro, these two teachings are very easy to misunderstand. And then even if one develops some clear intellectual understanding of these teachings, it's very easy to fall into this, okay, now what? What am I supposed to do with that? How do these teachings actually influence how I live my life? So it's actually very easy to put definitions up on the board, which I'm going to do. But the emphasis will really be on developing a deeper understanding of these teachings and actually beginning to see these teachings at work in our day-to-day lives. So I'd just like to take a couple steps back, which is why I chose this topic. In sort of modern American Buddhist circles, there are these conferences of American Buddhist teachers, and the people will gather, all these Buddhist teachers from various traditions. They'll gather, I think it's once a year or perhaps every other year, and they'll have these conferences to speak about, what is American Buddhism, what's unfolding, what are the important trends, what are the dangers, things like that. And in these conferences, it continues to be this really important question about what's the biggest danger for American Buddhism, for Western Buddhism. And many people feel this way, that the biggest danger for American Buddhism is that Buddhism just simply becomes another self-help technique. So in other words, self-help technique, what I'm pointing at here, is that we can use Buddhism just to make ourselves feel better about ourselves, to sort of reduce the amount of stress and anxiety in our lives, just to make our lives run more smoothly. So Buddhism can definitely result in making us better people, kinder people, more understanding people. And this is of incredible value, this fruit of practice, to become better, wiser people. And from a Buddhist perspective, if one were to stop there, one would just be scratching the surface of what's potential in Buddhism, of our own human potential. So that's why I've actually decided to take on this topic here of no self and emptiness, because this is pointing at complete and total liberation from suffering, from stress and anxiety. An existence is completely free of greed, hatred, and delusion. These are very big words. And we'll be spending 4 weeks exploring this. Okay? So this week, the taste of freedom, the wisdom of the body. And here in this first week, I'm actually going to be touching in on some of the topics that I explored with you all in January when I did this 4-week series. So in a way, this 4-week series is in a way a continuation of the 4-week series that I did with all of you in January. So you may hear some familiar things today as I explore this taste of freedom and wisdom of the body. The following week, next week, we'll be exploring this idea of using the mind to free the mind. It's a really fascinating topic. And then from there, for the following 2 weeks, we're going to move into this domain of what is called the Mahayana tradition in Buddhism. So Buddhism there are 3 sort of periods of Buddhism, main sort of teachings in Buddhism. Each one is a development based upon the previous. The first being the Theravadan, and then followed by that was the Mahayana, and followed by that was the Vajrayana. So I'll be saying more about these 3 great schools of Buddhism, and in particular during these final 2 weeks I'll be really delving into what it is that the Mahayana is pointing at. Of course I'll define that as well. And I'll also be sharing with you a bit about what my own personal practice looks like. So my personal practice, one of my great passions, one of my great inspirations, actually comes from the Japanese Pure Land tradition of Jodo Shinshu, which is a path of self-surrender. So I'll be sharing with you a bit of what that looks like for me. Okay. So this is the overview. Reflections on anatta and emptiness. So we can start with some sort of big questions here. So there's some big words here. Anatta. So what is that? What is no self? What is emptiness? What is freedom? What is wisdom? What is insight? These are all very big words that require some unpacking. Right, so the Buddha described wisdom in its fullest sense, he actually really struggled to, in a way, describe it, because in the end, it's actually indescribable with words. So this is a quote from the Buddha, straight from the Pali Canon. And he describes wisdom as deep, hard to see, hard to realize, beyond the scope of reason, and subtle. And he also described this a way in which we can actually develop insight, a clearer understanding of the way things actually are. And here it starts with intellectual understanding. So this is just simply a matter of listening, a matter of reading, watching videos on YouTube, and turning these teachings over in our minds and convincing ourselves, do these teachings actually make sense? Maybe they don't. So we can spend some time listening, reading, and just developing some sense of an intellectual understanding of what these teachings are pointing towards. Intellectual understanding. And then we actually need to move from intellectual understanding into what I like to call embodied knowing, where these teachings are no longer just simply ideas, intellectual understandings, but rather they become a part of who we are, just deeply ingrained in how we live in the world, just as natural as breathing. And this path of moving from intellectual understanding to embodied knowing, it requires some degree of reflection and some degree of contemplation. It actually requires more than just some degree. It actually requires quite a bit of reflection and contemplation. So we're going to start here with some degree of intellectual understanding. And then we're going to move into this reflection and contemplation stage over the course of this month. And we're going to be addressing questions such as these: emptiness, freedom, no self, wisdom, insight. What are these things? Okay, so I think that does it for the introduction, the training we'll cover. So we're just going to start with this teaching of emptiness. Now, this word emptiness, it's a translation of a word, shunyata. And it's very interesting with translations, because translations can be quite misleading. They can be both informative and misleading at the same time. So there is value in knowing what the original term is, and that gives us perhaps some indication of the limitations of the translations that are typically being used. So shunyata is very commonly translated as emptiness. So I looked up this word emptiness in the dictionary, and this is what I found. Emptiness, the first definition was a state of containing nothing, like an empty room. And the second definition, the quality of lacking meaning or sincerity, meaninglessness. Lacking meaning, lacking sincerity, just completely meaningless. So these are the definitions of emptiness. And it turns out that these definitions, they do not at all apply to shunyata. Well, there's a part of it that applies to shunyata. But in general, this is not what shunyata is pointing at. Shunyata is actually a state of complete fullness, of wholeness, of aliveness, of vibrancy, of spontaneity. It's a state of complete freedom. Now again, these are all just a bunch of words. It's pointing at something. And we're going to explore what it is that they're pointing at. So that's emptiness, based upon the dictionary. Now shunyata, what is shunyata? In the end, it's quite mysterious. And there's many different definitions one could give. So here I just threw one up that I found that I quite like. And shunyata, it's a mode of perception, a way of looking at experience that adds nothing and takes nothing away. Again. Okay, how is that helpful? What's going on here? Why is this so important? Why are you telling me this? So then, taking this top definition of emptiness, something is absent. Emptiness. I think that's a valid way of thinking about emptiness, is the absence of something. So shunyata, there are things that are absent when one is engaged in this way of perceiving in a shunyata sort of way. And the things that are absent or empty of shunyata, the experience of shunyata, is completely absent of the experience of greed, hatred, and delusion. And it's completely absent of stress and anxiety. And it's completely absent of the story of me. The story of me. So I spoke about this idea of the story of me back in January, which I'd just like to revisit. So let me say one more thing about this. In the Buddhist tradition, the Buddha was very clear about this in terms of cultivating wisdom. It's extremely important to know what is present and also what is not present. This is a skill that we can develop, to see what is present and to see what is not present. Now, I'll continue to come back to this particular theme of seeing what is present and seeing what is not present throughout the course of this month together. Because shunyata, it's actually something that's very hard to see. Emptiness. It's very subtle, it's hard to see. However, it's quite easy to see what not shunyata is. So it's easy to see what greed, hatred, and delusion look like and feel like. It's very easy to see this story of me. We may not see these that clearly. Our seeing of these things may not be particularly accurate, but nonetheless we can still see them. So in this case, we can approach this teaching of shunyata in terms of seeing what is present and recognizing that those things are not aligned with this shunyata way of seeing. And perhaps there are some things in your life where you do get glimpses of this, what shunyata is pointing at. So we're going to continually come back to this theme, seeing what is present and seeing what is not present. And how can we use the mind to see more clearly, use the mind to free the mind. Okay, so the story of me. Now we're moving into developing a clear understanding of that which is present. Right, so the story of me is actually pointing at something quite specific. I'm using this little turn of phrase, the story of me, as a translation of, perhaps it's a translation of prapancha. So this word prapancha, it's a word that quite often comes up in Buddhist circles. And it's commonly translated as mental proliferation. Yeah, mental proliferation. So here's a very simple little exercise we're going to do together. I'm just going to name off 3 words, and we'll just notice what the mind does with these 3 words. Very simple. So we'll just sit quietly for a couple minutes, and I'll just drop these words into our meditations. Cat. Mouse. cheese. So I wonder if perhaps 2 or 3 people would like to share something from what you noticed. Yes.
I was just kind of developing a story about relationship.
I noticed that I immediately had images of those 3 depictions arise in my mind. And there wasn't much time for much else than to see, for instance, my sister's cat, a little gray mouse, and a chunk of the cheese I had for dinner last night.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Because of the order you gave them in, after you got to mouse, it automatically cut out a lot of things. Because obviously I thought of the cat eating the mouse. And then I thought, okay, what else can I think of? But I had to think about it because it sort of automatically just shut things out that if you'd done it in the reverse order or in a mixed order, it might not.
I was just aware that I was already 1,000 miles and 500 thoughts away when you said cat. It brought me back. And I didn't think of anything until you said mouse. And then it all went.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating just watching what the mind does. So this in Buddhism is called, I forget what the original word, I think it's Sanskrit or something like that. And it translates as concocting. So concocting, it's not a word that's all that common use. I never use this word. But I once heard somebody speak about this word concocting as in the context of cooking. So in the context of cooking, we can lay out all these different ingredients upon our countertops, and then we concoct something. We assemble something, we create something from these individual components, something that all comes together and somehow magically works together. Concocting. So this is what the mind does. There can just be this kind of random, or perhaps not so random, flow of thoughts through our minds. Cat, mouse, cheese. And this is the way our minds work. Our minds want to make sense of these words. They want to make sense of our experience. So our minds will arrange them in some sort of way that tells a story, that somehow is trying to make sense of. And sometimes the mind isn't even trying to make sense of. Sometimes the mind is just very entertained by thoughts. So our minds can just spin off into a million different directions. And this I like to call the circus of the mind. Our minds are just kind of constantly churning away in the background. Perhaps not constantly, but it can certainly feel like that. So this is what's called mental proliferation, prapancha. Just the mind's predisposition to generate thoughts, create ideas, create mind worlds, if you will. Now, prapancha, when I use this term, mental proliferation, it can sound quite, perhaps even benign, mental proliferation, just daydreaming. There's a lot of value in daydreaming. But in fact, in the Pali Canon, when this word is used, prapancha, it is referred to as a negative mental state. It's actually referred to as something that is harmful, something that needs to be addressed, eradicated, transformed. So the Buddha was not pointing at anything positive here around prapancha. He was definitely pointing at something negative, something that binds us to suffering. So in terms of prapancha, how does this bind us to suffering? What's the Buddha pointing at here? And fundamentally, this little diagram here, this one here in the middle, is the way that I like to communicate this idea of how we bind ourselves to suffering, how we create stress and anxiety for ourselves. So up top here, I've got I must have, I must not have. This is our tendency to insist that things need to be a certain way for me to be happy. And then if I happen to get what I want, I can arrive at this state of now I'm happy. If I happen to get stuck with something I don't want, we'll arrive at now I'm not happy. And then around and round we go. Now, this arrival at I'm not happy, unfortunately, that's not the end of the story. Because this happiness, as we all know, it's ephemeral. It doesn't last. It's not reliable. And I love this word, reliable. Because Buddhism, in terms of liberation, in terms of freedom, Buddhism is actually speaking of a happiness that is reliable. But in this case, we're talking about a happiness that is not reliable. So it's quite interesting here to even explore this idea of happiness that is reliable and happiness that is not reliable. So I think this is an excellent area for each of us to individually to contemplate, to turn over in our minds. So in our lives, there's happiness and there's other stuff too. And we can notice the quality of this happiness, the quality of this pleasure that is in our lives. So there can be happiness that binds. Binds to what? Well, the things that come to mind is, binds us to suffering. It may bind us to more happiness. So, of course, those of us who have or know people or who have been involved in or perhaps are involved presently in compulsive, addictive patterns of behavior, we know that when we are engaged in that, there is some happiness in that cycle of addictive behavior. And we also know that it doesn't last. It actually reinforces this negative tendency to crave. And it doesn't actually lead anywhere. This is just an example of happiness that binds. Happiness that, and we can juxtapose that with happiness that frees. Happiness that is nourishing, inspiring, opening. So I'd like to invite all of you just to turn this over in your mind during this coming week, of just the quality of happiness that exists in your life. So now I'm just going to point at the happiness that binds, and specifically that binds us to suffering. So in terms of this prapancha, the story of me, so at the root of prapancha, of mental proliferation, is the story of me. Prapancha begins with, it's all about me. It's all about my happiness. It's all about me getting what I want and me getting away from what I don't want. This is the root of suffering. And this is what's being pointed at specifically by prapancha. And prapancha, in terms of this creation of stories in our mind's tendency to do this, one very good way to see how these stories manifest is through the perspective of what are called the 8 worldly winds. So this here is a very well traversed piece of teaching in the Buddhist tradition, the 8 worldly winds. And it's given here in 4 sets of pairs. And I quite like these pairings, and also the description of this idea that these worldly winds represent the push and pull of our desires, the push and pull of our cravings, the push and pull of our aversions. So these pairs, we've got praise and blame. So you've got juxtaposed something we want, praise, with something we don't want, blame. We've got success and failure, pleasure and pain, fame and disrepute. So it's very interesting also, looking closely at these 8 worldly winds. Now, some people I know, they're very predisposed to wanting more information. So I have a friend of mine who would immediately go away and get onto Wikipedia and look up the 8 worldly winds and start reading about what these things are. Perhaps getting on YouTube and finding some other Buddhist teachers talking about this stuff. So we could take that approach of getting more information about what these 8 worldly winds are. And there's value in doing that. And there's also value in just turning this over in our own minds, upon reflecting upon these teachings more deeply, contemplating. And as I've contemplated these pairs, I will notice that there will be specific pairings that will tend to leap off the page, that will strike me more deeply. Or perhaps another image will cut more deeply, perhaps to the bone. Something here that makes me kind of go, ooh, that's a little too close to home. We may notice this. And that's something that's very, very important to notice. This here is the story of me. This is how I see the world. This is how I bind myself to suffering. And if those words don't fit, this is how I bind myself to suffering, that too can become a reflection. Is that really true? Is this story of me, does it actually bind me to suffering? Is that true? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So that's something that we each need to explore for ourselves to see the truth of this. Or not. Right? So the story of me. So how do we go about working creatively with the story of me? And how can we move into an experience that is free of the story of me? That is empty of the story of me. What does that look like? What does that even mean? Well, this is a quote that I'm sure I shared with all of you in January. It's one of my favorite quotes because it says something about the process of transformation. So it's a quote from the Buddha. That which one brings to mind frequently becomes the tendency of the mind. That which one brings to mind frequently becomes the tendency of the mind. And in regards to this quote, I recently came across this little term it was from a Tibetan teacher. And the Tibetans, they speak of mind streams. So I quite like this image of a mind stream. And this goes along with another image that's straight from the Buddhist teaching, straight from the Pali Canon, where the Buddha speaks about these ruts of the mind. So you can imagine a dirt road with ruts in it. And as the water runs through these ruts, the ruts just become deeper and deeper. And then the water will gather there in these ruts and will continue to do so. These are the mind streams. These are mind streams. These are ruts of the mind. This is the habitual patternings of our mind. So in terms of noticing what's there, we can ask this question is, where is my mind? Where does it tend to go? What's the predisposition of my mind? What are the habitual tendencies of my mind? It's very, very important questions to ask. Now, shifting into this process of transformation, this teaching also is a doorway. It's the doorway to liberation here. It's being pointed at here. Because we can bring to mind the story of me, how I'm getting what I want or not getting what I don't want, or how I don't like my neighbor, blah, blah, blah. We can bring all of that stuff to mind, how the world's going to hell in a handbasket. We can do that. Then we can ask ourselves this question of, if I continue to do this, and perhaps you already do, where is this leading? Is this leading to greater stress and anxiety? Or is it leading to greater peace, understanding, love, compassion? Where is this leading? It's a really, really important point. So what I'd like to suggest is actually some little tips here on bringing to mind things that do lead to greater freedom. So when we are completely immersed in the story of me, now I'd like to bring to mind this way of looking in terms of space. And again, this is something I spoke about in January with all of you. This dynamic of space, this actual experience of space. So in terms of space, it's a spatial metaphor. So we can experience this sense of contracting, of tightening, of binding. And the other end of that spectrum is this sense of opening and loosening, spaciousness, peace and calm. So a good friend of mine, who's a Buddhist teacher, he once said to me, he said, it is physically impossible to simultaneously be angry and have an open and relaxed body. It's just simply not possible because of this mind-body connection. So when we are in these negative mental states, these states of anxiety, I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable, I'm not getting what I want, whatever the story may be, we can notice if we tune into our bodies, any sort of sense of contraction, the body tightening, the heart tightening, and even our minds tightening. So this is quite a nice image of an aperture, this invisible aperture that's in front of our mind's eye. And sometimes this aperture can just narrow down to just this pinpoint where the only thing we see is that which is causing us suffering. We see only one thing. All we see are perhaps that which we are obsessively driven towards, compulsively driven towards, or that which is getting in the way of our happiness. And we only see this one story, this one narrative. We can feel everything contracting down upon this one narrative. And when we experience this, a wonderful thing to do is just simply to pause and open and relax. And a very easy way to do this is just simply to take 3 deep breaths. Because deep breathing has a physiological effect. This is scientifically proven. Deep breathing, just 3 deep breaths, has the scientifically proven effect of lowering one's blood pressure and reducing the levels of cortisol in our blood system, which is the stress hormone. So when we breathe deeply, we actually can relax our bodies, which then can also open up our hearts and open up our minds as well. This is very important, the ability to actually pause. And if we're able to pause and enter into a more spacious place, a less constricted place, we can begin to ask some questions about what's going on. And again, this comes back to reflection, asking questions. So I've written here some questions that have been very alive for me in the recent past and continue to be quite alive. So this is kind of an interesting question. What is the shape of my mind? And again, shape it's just a metaphor. Please don't take that literally. What is the story of me? Where does my mind tend to go? What are the ruts of my mind that bind me to suffering? In any one of these questions, if there's any one of those questions that kind of strikes you, I'd invite you to turn that question over in your mind. I think this is a really helpful question. I've been using this one for years now, is when I find myself immersed in this state of suffering. Usually involves another person doing something that I don't like. I notice that in my mind. That's my tendency. And I can get into this big story about what's going on. And then in that space, I tend to exaggerate. I tend to engage in this all or nothing thinking. That person never does this, and that person's blah, blah, blah. It just spins out. When I notice this, pause, relax, just breathe. And I like to drop in these questions, just to open things up. To sort of take that aperture, just narrow down, and just open it up. And just look again with fresh eyes. What else is there? What else is there? So in this case of just being really angry or frustrated at someone, it's very interesting to just notice this tendency, perhaps of the mind, to just push that away. I can't deal with that. But this question of what else is there, it's not a denying of what's happening. It's actually acknowledging what's happening. So perhaps a question before this is, what is there? In this example, anger. And just notice that. How does it feel to be angry? What does that feel like? Acknowledge it. Give it some space to breathe. And then take that experience, anger, and just set it to the side. Don't deny it. Don't put it in the closet. Just put it to the side. And just ask the simple question, what else is there? Here's another good question. What am I not seeing? What am I not seeing? So I think this is a really fascinating question, because this question, implicit in this question, is that there is something that I am not seeing in this situation. So if you're not sure about that, this question could be, is there something else here that I am not seeing? Maybe there isn't. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. And that's something for you to discover. Clint.
Quick question. How can you answer that question, what am I not seeing, if you're not seeing it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of answering questions, we can answer questions. Sometimes questions, these sorts of big questions, are really valuable in that responses, they don't present themselves immediately like they do on Wikipedia. That these very deep questions, there is a process whereby those questions, they need to germinate in our minds. They need to just simply be there in our minds. We need to open up to these questions and allow clarity to arise. This idea of just trusting emergence. So these questions, they can go on for years, actually. And it's very interesting because when we get into the deeper waters of practice, which I'll be touching on as we go through this 4-week series, is the mind will become much more comfortable with seeming paradoxes, which is also quite interesting. So I'm not sure if that helps, Glenn.
It's food for thought.
Yeah, it's food for thought. Yeah. So what I'd like to do now is I've actually written these questions under the header of practice commitments, suggested practice commitments. So everything here is an invitation. So it's quite wonderful that we will be together for 4 weeks. It gives the opportunity to actually take a particular topic and just go deeper with it, explore it from different perspectives, and really attempt to plumb the depths of what's being gotten here by Shunyata and Anatta. So during this month, I'd like to suggest or invite everyone to meditate more. So more is totally up to you, and more is based upon whatever your current baseline of meditation is. So if you don't meditate, that's fine. Maybe try meditating 10 minutes a day, 3 times a week. Meditate a little more. If you already meditate every day for 30 minutes, perhaps try meditating every day for 40 minutes, or twice a day, something like that. Yeah, just try and meditate a little bit more than you normally do, and just pay attention and notice how that affects your experience. Meditate a little more. And the second commitment / invitation is to spend some time reflecting more deeply, contemplating more deeply. In particular, notice when the mind is in this information gathering mode. Oh, I just need to read one more Wikipedia entry. I need to just watch one more video. I need to read one more book. And rather than looking for more information, one might just take what you already have and just look more deeply at that. Ask the questions and just wait patiently for the answers to unfold. It is 11:50 right now, and what I'd like to do now is just to spend kind of 5 or perhaps 10 minutes inviting all of you to share your comments or questions, because what I would like to do is for the following 3 weeks, I would like to weave your own interests, your comments and questions into the terrain that I will be covering. So I have a pretty good idea of where I'm going, beginning, middle, and end. But I'm not quite sure how I'm going to get there. So your questions will act as a guide for me in a particular way.
If I may just mention, we'll do 5 minutes because then we have to wrap up.
Perfect.
Announcements. So,
yeah. So if you do have questions, I may not answer them. I might just write them down. Yeah.
Jay.
And could you start with your name first, please? Jay.
So I'd like a better understanding of one of your pairings under the 8 worldly winds, because 3 of them appear to me to be direct opposites, and I can see the push and pull of praise and blame, success and failure, pleasure and pain. I see those. What I don't see as opposites, because maybe I misunderstand, is fame and disrepute, because to me, they seem to like fame, if it's in a good way, it's being widely known, and being widely known, disrepute in a bad way. So those don't appear to be opposite. It seems to me more like the opposite of fame would be anonymity. And so if I could get a clearer understanding of that, of the intention, I'd appreciate it.
Great. What'd you say? What was the word you used?
Anonymity?
Anonymity. Anonymity.
Or a claim and disrepute.
What's that?
Oh. I'm not spelling that word.
A claim as the opposite of disrepute.
Yeah, so I can say something more about that next week. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, I'm wondering about your thought.
Remind me of your name.
David.
David.
I'm wondering about your thought of do we have an evolutionary and genetic cultural inclination to thoughts and being which end up in suffering? And what can we reasonably change in a lifetime?
Fantastic. That's a great question. I'm definitely planning on covering that.
Jason.
Hi, Jason.
Just a reflection in regards to what Clint's question was, is that I think that other people or situations sometimes will show you what you're not seeing as you develop more like presence to the to cultivating presence, cultivating mindfulness. I think that will help you or helps me sometimes recognize what I'm not seeing.
Thank you, Jason. Sir.
My name's Bob.
Hi, Bob.
Clint's question also got me thinking. I hadn't thought about the question in that way. And I got the picture in my mind almost immediately of, what am I not seeing? My face is pressed against the wall. I can't see the sides of the room. I can't see the ceiling. I can't see the floor. But if I step back, I can see more. And I started relating that to issues in my own life and what I need to be doing to get away from the stress and the feelings of unhappiness that exist. So I kind of like the idea that you brought that up with, because now I can think about stepping back and seeing more.
Mm-hmm. That's a very nice image, Bob. Thank you.
Okay, I think we can stop right there. Thank you, Danadasa.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Okay, so it's time for announcements. Donna is the Poly word for giving. Our host today will pass the Donna bowl. The suggested donation is $10, but whatever you can freely give is always greatly appreciated by the Sangha. It does cover our rent, our newsletter, our speakers, our Larkin Street dinners, the mailers that we do once a month. So thank you in advance for that. Our speaker next week will be Danadasa. And once again, his topic for next week is using the mind to free the mind. With that, let's see, our host today, David?
I'm your host. I'll be in charge of the Donna Bowl, and if I don't approach you, why don't you approach me? There is hot water for tea. If you want tea, you're welcome to just put your teacups in the sink, and I'll take care of those. There's also a sign-up sheet if you want to get on the contact list for the Sangha. You can put your name on the sign-up sheet. And there's also a meeting at the front door if you're wanting to get involved with going out to lunch with other members of the Sangha. Sometimes people meet there for lunch.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I'm the coordinator of the hosts, and we could use a couple of more people to volunteer to host, which involves basically taking responsibility once every 2 months for refreshments in the social hour. So coming right up next week, we don't have a host, and also on the week of the retreat. So if anybody is interested in contributing to the Sangha in that way, please talk to me during the social hour.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Roy briefly mentioned the Larkin Street project. For those of you who may not know what that means, Larkin Street is a homeless shelter for young people, kind of ages 22. And for quite a few number of years now, we do a monthly dinner every third Saturday of the month where we go in and we prepare a meal that's probably more elaborate and fancier than what they normally get to eat. It's more kind of like just to give them a nice comfort food type experience. So it's done by volunteers. If you're interested, if that sounds like something you'd like to get involved in, please contact me and I'll put you on a list of volunteers. Sometimes I have no problems filling up getting the team together. Sometimes, because people's lives are so busy and committed, that it gets to be a little difficult. And on rare occasions, I have to cancel the dinner for a month because there's not enough people signing up. So again, if that's something that's interesting you, just corner me and I'll get your contact information.
There's a couple of things I actually would like to mention before we go ahead and do our dedication of merit. I was at the Shanti Gala about a week or so ago. Charlie Garfield, who started the Shanti project in the mid-70s, has recently written another book called Life's Last Gift, which is giving and receiving peace when a loved one is dying. I just recently read the entire book, and it's a really beautiful book. And I just want to pass that information along because I think it's a vital book, not just for those of us who will eventually go through helping a loved one, a partner, someone in their dying time, but also to keep that book in mind for someone who perhaps is going through this right now, who is assisting a loved one, who is dealing with a loved one's diagnosis. It's a really lovely book. It's called Life's Last Gift, and it has ideas, insights, exercises that I think you can apply to any part of your life. So keep that book in mind. And for those of you who have never heard Charlie speak, if you go into the archive on gaybuddhist.org, on May 15th of 2016, he did a beautiful talk called Love Heals that I think that would be wonderful to hear.
I think he's also going to be appearing at Strut, I think maybe this coming week, Strut on Castro, the community center, talking about his book and whatever.
Oh, okay.
I posted that on our Facebook page, but I don't remember the date. I don't think it passed this week. I think it's upcoming next week.
Okay, great, thank you.
So look on Facebook.
It's a really beautiful book. I highly urge you to check it out, and his talk as well, and hopefully next year he'll come back to do another talk for us. We're actually planning it. And one more thing, the GBF retreat is at the end of this month, and also very nourishing to the soul is really cool shows or productions. And there is a show that ACT at the Strand Theater is doing that begins this week called Small Mouth Sounds, and I want to read this to you about the show. It says, on a week-long silent retreat in the woods, 6 wildly disparate urbanites looking for life balance find that staying quiet doesn't necessarily bring inner peace. An acclaimed new comedy from Drama Desk Award-winning playwright Bess Walls, Small Mouth Sounds is a wickedly sharp look at mindfulness and the wellness industry. Under the eye of an unseen guru, 6 people have gathered to get away from it all, but as they listen to their leader's ruminations and struggle to meditate while clumsily fighting their most primal of urges, they learn that silence can indeed be golden. It can also be funny, frustrating, erotic, comforting, and profoundly passive-aggressive. Small Mouth Sounds won over audiences and critics alike off Broadway, and it's an intimate and imaginative storytelling is perfect for the Strand Theater. So that starts this week, and it sounds like a lot of fun. So if anybody who's been to on a retreat, they can probably relate.
I happened to see it last year in New York, and it's a wonderful play.
Cool.
Recommend it to this group.
Excellent. Thank you. And with that, let's go ahead and stand for our dedication of
By the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow, and may all live in equanimity, without too much attachment or too much aversion, believing in the equality of all that lives.
Thank you for today, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month, and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live. Please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.